Hello, and welcome to So, Hear Me Out, the podcast where classical music meets big questions from London's Southbank Centre.
I'm Gillian Moore, broadcaster, writer and artistic associate at Southbank Centre.
And I'm Linton Stevens, musician, broadcaster and illustrator.
Each episode we start with a question, something bold, sometimes tricky, and we each bring one piece of music that we think responds to it.
It could be a classic that you've heard 100 times, or a hidden gem that deserves the spotlight.
This isn't just music history, it's about how the music feels and why it still matters and why you should care.
And today's episode might just be one of our most powerful yet. We're asking, can classical music offer peace, hope, or even resistance behind bars?
I've chosen a piece which was written in a Nazi prisoner of war camp in 1941, using the instruments they had on hand, performed by fellow prisoners. It's otherworldly, transcendent, and once heard, it's never forgotten. It's Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time.
And I've brought a feminist anthem composed in 1910 that became a battle cry for the suffragette movement, even echoing through prison walls as women marched and protested for the vote. It's Ethel Smyth's March of the Women.
These aren't just pieces of music, they're acts of defiance, of survival, of imagination.
So, whether you're a seasoned classical fan or just curious at what makes music so powerful, join us as we delve into some great music together.
This is episode 5, Music Behind Bars. Can we find emancipation through music?
So Gillian, why are we talking about this theme today? Why is it important to you?
I really wanted to talk about this because I've always been fascinated by the role that music plays in prisons. When I was young and in my 20s, I did a lot of work actually with the London Sinfonietta, where I was working in Holloway Prison, which was a women's prison in Wormwood Scrubs, in D Wing, in the Life Wing. And we took all sorts of projects and programs into the prison and just found that the power of music in that situation was something that none of us ever would have anticipated. People were really hungry for what music could bring. It really sort of liberated imaginations. We were composing music together with prisoners, writing songs. We were also bringing in, some quite out there avant-garde classical music. So I remember, for example, a performance of Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale, and we'd worked with the prisoners leading up to that on their own work. But, that's a story of, it's a Faustian story of someone who sells their soul to the devil, and, things like when he comes back after being away for many years, he finds his girlfriend's married somebody else. And, those things, they just hit home in a way that in a concert hall, there's somehow a bit more distance. It's a bit more pretend somehow. And it was sometimes even quite shocking about the immediacy of the effect.
I wonder why that is. How much, maybe you don't know this, how much access do they have to music?
Well, it varies enormously, but we were working, I'm just thinking about working in the D Wing of Wormwood Scrubs, where people are locked in the cells for large parts of the day. If they're lucky, they have access to education, but it's very limited. So we were able to work over a long period of time. And, one thing you find out is that nearly everybody loves music. Nearly everybody has a kind of identification with music in some way or another, whether it's a personal thing, whether it's a cultural, a national thing. Everybody can relate to music, and everybody can use music to express things that it might be difficult to express otherwise.
I wonder in the first instance if there was such a hunger for it because they don't have the freedom to access it that they would have on the outside. I think we have such a human connection to music that to suddenly be removed from it or for your access to it to be controlled, I wonder whether that then increases your hunger for it.
Well, I think that's certainly the case. And, so many of us, I was going in with some really top musicians and we were just really almost taken aback. We were taken aback by what hunger there was for what we were doing. And we could go really quite far with some quite, out there musical ideas and pieces of 20th century classical music, for example. Because we were dealing a lot with more contemporary music, we did a project on German composer Hans Werner Henze's song cycle, which is called Voices. And that song cycle is about voices of people who didn't have a voice. So, people in poverty, people, soldiers, people in war zones, and people in prison, in fact, a whole collection of different poems. And those experiences, those songs, you might look at programming them in a London venue and think, that's quite risky programming because, it's not a very well-known composer. It's not popular classics or anything like that. But because these things resonated with, the here and now and actually with their experience, there was just much more connection to the music. And the performers really felt that. They really felt that their music was somehow going deeper.
And did the prisoners perform as well?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So
that's an additional thing in and of itself, isn't it? That they then get to something that they will have taken for granted, something that we do in the UK very often in like primary school, less so in high school, to suddenly have this access to this form of self-expression that and an organised form of self-expression. Because I imagine, anyone can sing on their own in a prison cell, but to suddenly be united with other people and to be connected with people in that way.
Yeah, and sometimes we'd say we want to set a poem, and then people would go off for their very long lunch break, would come back with a fully formed poem. We would then spend the afternoon setting that to music with, some of the greatest musicians around. And we're working actually as equals. And that sounds sentimental, but it wasn't, because the way we were working, everybody's ideas had equal weight. And they brought their ideas to the table. Then it would be worked up, rehearsed, refined, performed alongside the piece of Henze or Turnage or Stravinsky or whatever it was. And those things were seen as the sort of, I guess, the equivalent of each other, and they reflected each other. And it's a very exciting way to work. So, Linton, what piece of music have you brought to really illustrate this idea about the power of music behind bars?
So, hear me out, Gillian. I've brought Ethel Smyth's March of the Women. Ethel Smyth was born in 1858. And so she was very, very firmly in the Romantic era. And she, like a lot of women composers, had to kind of struggle to be allowed to study music. So her father was a military man and he was against her studying music, but she was a child prodigy. She was extremely talented, and eventually he managed to convince her that, she managed to convince him rather, that a career in music was a viable career for her. So she went over to study in Leipzig under Karl Reinecke, but left her studies in less than a year, because she wasn't happy with the quality of the teaching that she was receiving. So she formed friendships with the likes of Dvorak and Grieg and Tchaikovsky, and she came back home, and then she started to compose music. She still wasn't kind of gaining the acclaim of her male counterparts. In fact, very often what would happen is she would write a new piece of music and critics would say, it's not comparable to a man's music because it's not more powerful. It's not powerful enough. And then when she did write more powerful music, they would be like, this is not music that a woman should be writing. It's not demure enough.
So tell us about her connection with the suffragette movement. I mean, to me, it seems that she was much more than just a sympathizer or someone who provided some music for some events. She really was at the heart of it, wasn't she? She was really part of it.
I mean, yeah, and that's how she became close as well to Emmeline Pankhurst, who is one of the most famous British suffragettes. Around the time that the women didn't have the vote, she was a staunch advocate for women to be able to have the vote. She was very involved in lots of activist movements, lots of resistance movements. The piece is called March of the Women. So shall we have a little listen to the opening of it?
Shout, out with your song, cry with the
Ethel Smyth's March of the Women, chorus and orchestra of the Plymouth Music Series with Edwin Harry and Philip Brunel. So, for me, musically, immediately you get this declamatory opening, which almost sounds like a hymn. And if we think about what is the purpose of a hymn is to bring people together to sing something that unites people in a cause. Now, obviously, a hymn is a religious cause, but this is something slightly different. But I like how it puts the two on an equal footing.
It immediately makes me think of the hymn Onward, Christian Soldiers by Arthur Sullivan, as in Gilbert and Sullivan. And that's a hymn that I certainly, for one, grew up singing in church. And it's, part of that tradition of quite militaristic hymn tunes that are supposed to get you, marching and battling forward.
It's interesting.
In the cause.
It's interesting you mention him, because I think when she came back to the UK after studying in Germany, she formed quite a close friendship with Arthur Sullivan, who, of course, was another great composer. So the piece was composed in 1910 to the words that Cecily Hamilton wrote, which was the anthem. The words were the anthem of the Women's Social and Political Union, and actually more widely used for the suffragette movement. And it was very actively sung at rallies, and whilst also very famously sung by women who were on hunger strike in prisons. So immediately there, you've got this piece of music that unites people in a cause of resistance under being locked up. And I think it's that element that I find so fascinating about this. And there's a really interesting and famous moment that was captured in history of this piece being sung. So it was sung a few times famously at the Royal Albert Hall, where Ethel Smyth was presented with a baton by Emmeline Pankhurst and conducted this whole group of women's activists singing it. But also the most famous, and lots of people know of this legend, the most famous rendering of it took place in 1912 at Holloway Prison, after many women activists were imprisoned as a result of breaking windows, a campaign that they ran. And Smyth's part had been to break the window of Lewis Harncourt, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. So she was also imprisoned. And the conductor, famous conductor Thomas Beecham, said that he'd visited Smyth in prison during her time of incarceration and reported that he found the activists in the courtyard singing this piece, marching round, lustily singing their war chant, while the composer hung out of a window conducting with a toothbrush. So,
between the bars, it said, yes, with her toothbrush.
So that image, I just think it encapsulates this thing so incredibly well.
Yes, it's also very catchy, isn't it? It's very musically simple. It's important to say it's not that like lots of our other music, because I mentioned the records, the opera, and that's much more organic, much more flowing. But it's got a real simplicity about it. People can remember that tune. In fact, we did a kind of mini revival of it at the Southbank, when for about 10 years we had annual concerts in the Women of the World Festival, with a women's orchestra, and Sandy Toksvig was the leading light behind that. And we'd always end with a March of the Women, with a women's orchestra playing, and Sandy would conduct the audience with her toothbrush.
100 years later, throughout time, it's become this huge mark of resistance, and it continues to unify people, I think.
I think the shape of the melody actually helps with the kind of the hopeful message of this song, of this anthem.
Well, that's a really important point, isn't it? You're incarcerated. It's quite a dark time, I imagine, for most people. And I imagine a lot of people aren't treated very well in incarceration. And this is quite an uplifting piece, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, you've just got that, it first starts, is it shout, that's very simple, repeated note, and then you've got a rising line. Yes, exactly. And then you go da, 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 da. That's just an arpeggio, a broken chord down.
Melody,
very simple. That's already 3 really simple musical shapes that everybody can get behind, and yet they're somehow uplifting and stirring. And I think although it seems on the surface utterly simple in musical terms. It's actually really clever, the way that it works on people's, you can almost feel yourself physically opening up when you sing that second phrase, da, 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 da. It's huge, it just takes you up. And then you all come down again on the sort of big fanfare. It's da, 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 da. It sounds like a fanfare. It's really kind of...
And then you get this little...
Excuse my horrible voice.
Then you get this little bit of sequence, don't you? Bum 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 bum. Which again is really memorable. One of the great elements of this piece is how easy it is to latch onto that melody and how memorable that melody is. I chose this particular version that we're listening to because I love that in the second verse, which we'll hear in a second, you then get a solo voice singing it. And I think that's a really, in and of itself, a really interesting way, because there's lots of different versions of this song. But it's a really interesting way to present it, because then you have this idea of somebody who's there. Very often resistance movements need a leader. They need somebody to rally people. They need somebody very often to be the spearhead of a movement. And I think very cleverly, you immediately hear the choir. So you hear everybody singing together, unified voices fantastically. And then you get the sound of this solo singer. And then if we think about the lyrics as well, the whole way through, I'll just give you a couple of examples, but they're lyrics that speak to one's sense of resistance. So that very opening, shout, shout up with your song, immediately calling for you to use your voice, the thing that all of us have got as your first form of resistance. Cry with the wind, for the dawn is breaking. It's like some kind of epic poem from, I don't know, years and years ago, isn't it? And it speaks to something in you. It's a battle cry, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a battle cry. It's got all the elements of a battle cry.
And then long, long we in the past, cowered in dread from the light of heaven. It's telling you, it's enticing you in with this tale of no more are we going to be in the dark. We are going to be heard. We are going to be seen. And this is one of my favorite comrades. I mean, that's a word that's used so often in kind of union speak. Ye who have dared first in the battle to strive in sorrow. For me, it kind of pulls at something internal about, that feeling that we all have when we're collectively there for a cause. There's a sense of pride, a sense of nationalism even in it, something that is bringing people together in a form of resistance.
And it could apply to any cause, really, but the fact that it's sung by women, well, you usually hear it sung by women, I suppose you can't really underestimate how new that was, how different that must have felt. How daring that was. How daring that must have felt to hear women singing those kinds of words all together about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, for me, transcends 100 years and has so much resonance with today.
I mean, I was so torn because there's so many directions this could go in. There's music about prisoners, so I was thinking about Beethoven's amazing chorus of prisoners from the opera Fidelio. When the prisoners are brought out into the light, and that's one of the most uplifting moments in classical music, or much more real life, tragically, music that was written in Nazi concentration camps. So there's two operas, for example, written in Theresienstadt, Terezin, One is The Emperor of Atlantis by Victor Ullmann, and the other is Brundibar, which is a children's opera. And those were written or first performed in that camp. And, the terrible truth is that almost everybody who was involved in that, including the composers and the performers, including the children, were all very shortly afterwards murdered. So that's a very real life tragedy of music in prisons. But I decided to look at a piece that is really one of my absolute favourite pieces of music, not just for the extraordinary story of how it came about, but also just for the sound of the music itself. And that is the Quartet for the End of Time, Quatuor pour la fin du temps, by the French composer Olivier Messiaen.
It's such a compelling title.
Yeah.
Naming that title it's quite iconic, actually, isn't it? The piece in itself is iconic, and it's such a famous piece, but I think that title really says something, doesn't it?
Well, as I hope I'm going to explain, there's a number of reasons for that. Not just that, if you're in the middle of a world war in a freezing prisoner of war camp, which he was when he wrote and first performed this piece, it might feel like the end of the world is nigh, but it's to do with a number of other interpretations of that as well. But maybe it's good to talk about who Messiaen was initially, just to start off with. So, French composer, he lived from 1908 to 1994. He was intensely religious, very spiritual person, but particularly devout Roman Catholic. He was also a very famous teacher of composers. He taught, all the kind of post-war avant-garde composers like Stockhausen and Xenakis was in his class for a while. So he's very influential, but he somehow pursued a very individual path of music that sounds quite different from any of those people. It's sort of intensely devotional music some of the time. It's very sensual music. It's full of nature and religious imagery. Messiaen really was a true one-off. Are you a Messiaen fan, Linton?
I've played a lot of Messiaen. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a fan, but I like some of his music. Oh,
well, there you go. Well, I hope I'm going to convert you. So I'm going to talk about the Quartet for the End of Time, which was written, or at least mostly written, and certainly first performed in a German prisoner of war camp in 1941 under the most extraordinary and severe circumstances by the composer himself. He performed it to the piano and three of his fellow prisoners, and it's very beautiful, it's very severe and intensely spiritual.
So you said it was written for him and three fellow prisoners. It's a really interesting orchestration or instrumentation, isn't it?
Well, it's funny because the reason it's written for piano, clarinet, violin and cello, which actually, fast forward to the 21st century, it's actually quite a lot of pieces written for that combination, but that's because Messiaen kind of was forced to invent it, because there were musicians in this camp. It was in Silesia on the Polish border of Germany. And there were quite a few musicians, but the ones that he got to know were, played those instruments. And they were really top professional musicians. One was in the French Radio Symphony. One was the principal cello of the Paris Opera. And they were there. So they made do with that ensemble. And it meant that he was able to sort of almost invent a new sound.
And is that to do with the availability of the prisoners when it was being written?
Well, it's interesting because they're being held by German officers. And all of them said, there's lots of accounts of how this was written, but all of them said that the Germans, a lot of them were, really quite cultured, and they wanted to be seen to be cultured. So musicians were given slightly special treatment. And Messiaen in particular, because he was actually still quite young. He was in his early 30s when he was captured. But he was quite well known as a musician. He was the organist at La Trinité Church, a huge church in the centre of Paris. And that was a big deal job. And he'd already written some significant pieces. So he was already quite well known, and he was immediately furnished with pencils, rubbers, manuscript paper. And when it became clear that he had a project in mind with these other three musicians, well, they had one problem, which was that the only person who had their instrument with them was Henri Acoca, who was the clarinet player. But there was no cello and there was no violin. So a particular German officer who was particularly keen to see this happen, he took them shopping to the local town to get instruments. There were lots of myths and mythologies grew up around this first performance, including perpetrated by Messiaen himself, who said, the cello only had 3 strings. But in fact...
I've heard that one.
Yeah, in fact, Pasquier said, there's no way you could play this on an instrument. My instrument had all 4 strings were present and correct. But they did have, some time and space to rehearse. But don't forget the conditions nonetheless were brutal. They were freezing cold. They were hungry. This camp was thrown up very quickly. There wasn't enough food to go around. They had no idea how they were going to do that. So I think the first thing to say about this piece, which is full of colourful visions of the end of time. It's based on the biblical book of Revelation, which in itself is, it's actually, I always think it's a little bit trippy, it's all these sort of crazy images of sapphire lakes and an angel with crowns of rainbows, etc., and lions and lambs and all that sort of thing. But Messiaen said that, one of the reasons, he would always attribute his driving force as being religious and to do with, praising God. That was his driving force. But he also said that the reason that he saw all these vivid colours and he dreamt in colours and he had these visions was because he was freezing cold and he was starving. So he was sort of forced into a kind of almost hallucinatory state by the extreme physical conditions as he was writing this music. The piece is in 8 movements and it's got titles which are all either to do with nature, which was an absolute obsession of Messiaen's, but also titles from the Book of Revelation. Just let's hear the 3rd movement of the quartet, which was in fact the first thing to be composed because in fact, Messiaen met Henri Acoca, the clarinet player, before they actually arrived at the camp, when they were being they'd just been arrested in eastern France and they were being transported. They were all being held in a field. And Messiaen wrote, they were waiting for ages and ages, and Messiaen wrote this solo clarinet player. And the story goes that he scribbled it down on some notepaper, and Pasquier, the cellist, who was also in that field, held it up. He acted as the music stand, and Acoca played it, and it's called The Abyss of the Birds. Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, Martin Fröst, Lucas de Barg, Torleif Tadin and Janine Jansen. That's very different from the music in the rest, or most of the rest of this piece. I mean, that's kind of quite sad, lonely.
It's very mournful.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Messiaen, as we'll find out, was very keen on birdsong.
Well, I was going to say, because he incorporated birdsong into almost all of his compositions, and I wondered if that was anything to do with this title.
This was at the beginning, near the beginning of him using birdsong, and this is like a very slowed down version of birdsong, but we'll hear much more explicit birdsong when we hear the first movement, which we'll hear in a second, of the quartet. I mean, He chose for his inspiration the Book of Revelation with all its vivid colours and kind of extraordinary images.
And of course, importantly, it's the book about the end of time as well.
It's the book about the end of the world. So the quote that he put at the beginning of the score says, "I saw a mighty angel descend from heaven, clad in mist, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was like the sun, his feet were like pillars of fire. He set his right foot on the sea, his left foot on the earth, and standing thus on sea and earth, he lifted his hand to heaven and swore by him who liveth forever and ever, saying, there shall be time no longer, but on the day of the trumpet of the seventh angel, the mystery of God shall be finished." So immediately in that quote, you've got lots of elements for this piece, which ended up being almost an hour long in 8 different movements, this visionary, colourful, spiritual
it's
thing.
Unsurprising. Well, am I right in thinking that Messiaen was also a synesthete as well?
Yeah, well, he heard. You'll actually, we're actually going to hear some of that in this next movement. When you say a synesthete, you mean he actually associated one as the state of associating one sense with another.
Yeah.
So in Messiaen's case, he heard specific chords and musical sounds as colours very precisely. So he would hear E major as, orange red, or I might have got this one wrong, but A major is, purpley blue, I think it was. But there was always a sort of...
I think it's dead important to note as well, because a lot of people think synesthesia is literally just colours and sounds.
Yeah.
But there's lots of cross-sensory synesthesia, isn't it? And colours and sounds is just one form of synesthesia.
Well, I don't hear colours and sounds, but days of the week now, that's another matter.
Really?
I see them in colours, yeah, definitely. Monday's red, obviously.
See, I see different colours when I play different notes on my bassoon.
Yeah. Well, you're in Messiaen.
But not quite chords.
A lot in common. But let's see. So let's hear the way the quartet actually opens. This is the first. You've got to imagine this is the first sound that the prisoners who are all huddled into the barrack room in the freezing cold would have heard. It's called Liturgy of Crystal, and Messiaen says about this: between the morning hours of 3 and 4, the awakening of the birds, a thrush or a nightingale soloist improvises amid notes of shining sound and a halo of trills that lose themselves high up in the trees. Transpose this to the religious plane, and you have the harmonious silence of heaven. So for us, just let's listen for the birdsong and the high violin and the clarinet, and also listen to the rhythm and the sound of the soft chords on the piano.
It definitely sounds like birdsong, doesn't it? It's unmistakable.
Absolutely the violin and the clarinet. And listen to those off-kilter rhythms on the chords of the piano. And that's one of Messiaen's interpretations of the idea of the end of time. So the piece is really where he first gets fully into thinking about changing the way we think about rhythm. He was trying to do away with, 1, 2, 3, 4 regular structured hierarchical rhythm with the strong beats and weak beats. And he would play almost mathematical games with rhythm, so that you get this sense of a floating, eternal sense of rhythm. He studied Indian rhythms to get, to help him with that, and also ancient Greek rhythms. But that is another really important idea of the end of time. So just if that movement was, as Messiaen described it, the silence of heaven, the second music starts with the violence of the angel of the apocalypse. It's the vocalise for the angel who announces the end of time. And you hear some violence, and then you hear between the violent sections, the outer sections, the sort of ineffable harmonies of heaven. From the piano, soft cascades, this is what Messiaen says, of blue-orange chords, there we go again, encircling with their distant carillon, the plain chant like recitativo, the kind of, monks chanting idea of the violin and cello. So that's where our synesthesia comes in. You hear the soft cascades of blue-orange chords. Do you hear them as blue-orange?
I don't hear them as blue-orange, but I love that description of cascading chords, because that's definitely what's happening on the piano.
And he talks about what he calls the plain song of the violin and cello, just like, supposed to be like monks chanting. I
don't know whether it's the fact that it's, in parts it's atonal, in parts it's fairly tonal. It feels, and I don't know if it's because I know the history and the reference, but it always feels mournful to me.
Something of that is to do with, and Messiaen's music can sound enormously joyful. Think about the huge Turangalila Symphony, which was written just maybe 5 years after that, which is sort of over the top in its joy. I think it's something to do with the language he chose, because when I say the language, I mean the actual notes, so the harmonies and the modes. He was a very systematic musician, even though it was always from a very emotional place. So he created whole systems of what we call modes, collections of notes, scales. And that, in fact, you mentioned about whether it's tonal or atonal, so whether it sounds like almost more conventional harmony or sort of dissonant, more out there dissonant music. And in fact, within a piece like this, because it's too technical to really go into, it would take a whole afternoon, but because of this modal system, he can quite easily move between the two. And the final bit of music we're going to hear does set ourselves up in what you might think of as a much more conventionally tonal world. But maybe before we do that, we should just briefly talk about the actual first performance of this piece, because it was a kind of one of those famous occasions in music history. There's lots of stories,
aren't there, about
this first performance? There are so many stories. And, Messiaen saying that there was only 3 strings on the cello, which was then disproved, is one of them. The fact that, which was probably true, that the upright piano that he had to play had lots of notes that stuck, and he had to keep pulling it up, etc.
That's another story that I heard, and that he had to compose around the difficulties of that piano as well.
Well, I think that was a bit more, I think that was a bit closer to the truth. But, it was quite, when they came on the stage, the 4 musicians, they were apparently wearing a sort of motley assemblage of bits of uniform from, all different nationalities that they could assemble. And they were allowed to have clogs, which was the big privilege thing, which kept your feet getting frostbite, etc. So the musicians had that special privilege. And then Messiaen said there were thousands of people crammed into that barrack hut, but of course that was not possible. And estimates range at around sort of 300 to 400, but it was definitely absolutely packed. German officers in the front row. And Messiaen said that the most diverse classes of society were there: farmers, factory workers, intellectuals, professional servicemen, doctors and priests. Never have I been listened to with such concentration. So I think in that context, it's, it'd be good to listen to what for me is the sort of, well, it's definitely, I'd say, the emotional heart of the entire piece. Just for future reference, if you're ever responsible for this is what I want played at my funeral, all right?
Well, hopefully I won't have to take that responsibility.
It's called Praise to the Eternity of Jesus. And it's really music which is, talk about the end of time. This music is almost impossibly slow. The cellist Pasquier complained that it wasn't possible to keep the bow going on the notes for the slow tempo that Messiaen wanted. And this idea of the end of time for me is the most explicit in this movement, because you've got these repeating chords in the piano and there's just never the amount that you think there's going to be. It's constantly changing meter. Sometimes you get 7, sometimes 8, sometimes 4, and it's just constantly sort of floating you on this feeling of eternal time. Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, Martin Fröst, Lucas de Barg, Torleif Tadin and Janine Jansen. So he's finding all these major chords, but it's in the same modal world, if you want to get technical, as the more dissonant parts of the quartet. But that language is very unified because he sort of got a real mastery of the way his musical materials work. But it also works on the rhythm as well, this idea of, I don't know whether my breath just slows down when I listen to that music.
Well, I think that's an effect of slower music anyway, doesn't it? It invites you into that world of especially with a piece like that is slower. And I think the very clever thing about this reference to the end of time, and yet there was a timelessness about that. When you listen to music, very often as musicians, the first thing we tune to is the beat and the sense of rhythm and how we relate to that as musicians. With that, even though you had these pulsating piano chords in the background, it felt like more like ripples on water than heartbeats.
Well, the pulsating chords, it's the fact that they change at unpredictable moments.
But the interesting thing, you're not tuned into that. So you're not. I'm not there. I'm not feeling the disjointedness of them not being equally spaced. They just exist somewhere.
It just takes you. Yeah, it makes you look further.
Yeah,
I think to the horizon. A fellow prisoner wrote a long time after. When he was remembering that performance, he said that music like this is an act of revenge against captivity. And the cellist Pasquier also wrote about it, and he said, "Here is a miracle. This quartet transports us to a wonderful paradise. It lifts us from this abominable earth." So they're thinking about the moment that they're in.
And that's the thing, I think, Gillian. Music can do that. It can lift us and transport us, even in the darkest conditions. But it's also complicated, because I think of Ethel Smyth, and her music was a real rallying cry. It was a call for resistance, and it did bring people together in powerful ways as well.
Yeah, and when I think about the work I was involved in with prisoners a long time ago, and that thing of writing songs together, I saw how music gave people a way out, not physically, but through their imagination, through their spirit, and the level of focus and emotional investment in that music was extraordinary.
So going back to that original question, can we find emancipation through music? I think the answer is yes, but I think the music itself will never escape.
Exactly. Music in prison isn't just a comfort or a distraction. Sometimes it's a cry, sometimes it's a bridge to another world, sometimes it's a mirror to yourself. But At its best, it reminds us that nobody is beyond the reach of beauty. Thanks for listening. So, Hear Me Out is brought to you by the wonderful people at the Southbank Centre.
And produced by the brilliant team at Reduced Listening.
Thanks for spending time with us. If you like this episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and maybe share it with a friend.
We love exploring big ideas through music, and we've got plenty more to come.
So join us next time for another adventure. Until then, keep listening, keep questioning,
and keep letting music surprise you. See you next time.